This is Polaris-Live. I'm your host, Sarwar Kashmeri. We want you to know that there is a problem in connecting with Mr. WEIJIAN Shan in Hong Kong. We will bring him on as quickly as possible, and I see him coming on right now.
I was on that website for about 10 minutes, but I didn't know there's one.
Sorry about that. We're live at this point.
Okay.
So thank you for joining me, and I'm sorry we're talking to you prior to your dinner time. I hope this is not too disruptive for you.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me.
No. So I'm going to take you off the stage momentarily as I introduce you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then bring you back. So the wonders of technology are working very well, probably because of the expertise of our guest today. So I want to tell you, this is Polaris-Live. I'm your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this global series of conversations on the US-China relationship, perhaps the most consequential relationship of our time. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association. My guest today is Mr. WEIJIAN Shan, who is chairman and CEO of PAG, a Hong Kong-based private equity firm. Over more than 20 years in investing, he has led a number of landmark transactions across Asia. He holds an MA and PhD from the University of California in Berkeley and an MBA from the University of San Francisco. Shan is the best-selling author of 2 books. His Out of the Gobi, My Story of China and America, has a foreword by Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, who's called it a powerful memoir and commentary that will be one of the most important books on China of our time, one with the potential to reshape how Americans view China and how Chinese view life in America. So we couldn't have a more timely guest on Polaris-Live, and let me now bring Mr. WEIJIAN Shan onto our stream. So good morning again. How is it in Hong Kong today? Bright and sunny?
Well, this is evening in Hong Kong at this hour.
Oh my goodness, look at that. I'm so sleepy. I hope I do a good job with my conversation with you.
No problem at all. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, you're very kind to make yourself... Sorry?
Please call me Shan. It's easier.
Okay, Shan, and please call me Sarwar. So let me start off by asking you. Last January, the U.S. Secretary Treasury of State Mike Pompeo, on his last day in office, declared that China was committing ongoing genocide against the Uighurs in Xinjiang. In March, the U.S. and the European Union imposed sanctions on China over alleged human rights violations against the Uighurs. So while the charge of genocide against China clearly appears unwarranted, the charge of human rights violations has stuck based on numerous media accounts. Recent hard-hitting editorial by you in the South China Morning Post was titled, Xinjiang, What the West Doesn't Tell You About China's War on Terror. So would you explain to our viewers where that comes from and what you meant, Shan?
Well, I think you have to think about the problems in Xinjiang in the context of what China is trying to achieve in that region. That context is terrorism. I used to visit Xinjiang from time to time on behalf of American investment firm, whose name I shall not name at this particular moment. We invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Xinjiang over time. And the companies we invested in employ thousands of people, both Han people and Uyghur people, as well as other minority nationalities. And the jobs we offered were very good jobs because we pay very high wages as private equity firm. And the investments were largely actually very successful, made a lot of money out of it. But starting around 2007, it became increasingly dangerous to visit Xinjiang because terrorism was getting out of hand. For example, in 2009, there was a riot in Urumqi, during which 197 people were hacked to death with knives and machetes. And in 2014, 2 suicide cars loaded with explosives rammed into a big market, open door market in Urumqi, killing 43 people and wounding numerous others. These are people of all ethnic groups because terrorism does not really discriminate. And the terrorism was not only confined to Xinjiang. In 2013, a few Uyghurs drove a car into Tiananmen Square in Beijing and killed 5 people, also injured numerous others. And in 2014, there was the incident in Kunming railway station. This was in Yunnan province of China. 8 knife-wielding Uyghurs killed dozens of people at the rail station and, of course, wounded many others. So terrorism was getting out of hand. And in fact, the perpetrator, the organization which claimed the responsibility, very often was East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which was listed by the State Department of the United States, of course, as a terrorist organization back in 2002, as did the United Nations. So, like the United States right after 9/11, China was faced with a serious threat of terrorism, and dozens of such terror incidents happened, mostly within Xinjiang, but outside of Xinjiang as well. So that is the context that is very much missing in the narratives about the issue in Xinjiang in the West. And that's what I wanted to point out in my article in the South China Morning Post.
Well, thank you for that very fine and succinct explanation of what brought you to write your editorial. What I want to also ask you is, it's just surprising to me that you had to explain this for a Western audience. And what I want to, in your editorial, Chan, you also say you advise China to win the information war. You advise China it should get the foreign press on its side. So what is happening here? Is that advice being understood by China? Can you just tell me, it seems like such an not simple, but direct solution to this issue. And if it is true, I hope you agree that the China-America relationship is the most consequential one of our time, that this is such an important item that you've brought up, and we just need to get to the bottom of it. So why isn't this working? Why isn't the story coming out? Can you tell us?
Well, I suppose many people simply don't know what's going on over there. And if you read the mainstream press, you don't hear about the stories that I just told, right? So many people simply are quite ignorant of the context that I just mentioned. Other people know, but they don't talk about it. For example, the US government commissioned a study in, I think, 2016 about the terrorism situation in Xinjiang. And some of the materials that I cited in my article are taken from that particular study. As another example, Uyghur fighters are very much part of the ISIS movement in Syria, in Iraq, elsewhere in the Middle East. And in America's war against terror, American forces actually fought with Uyghur fighters. For years, since 2002, American forces held a number of Uyghur fighters in Guantanamo Bay. And that's just a matter of fact. So it is not that nobody knew about it, but somehow people don't talk about it. And that's why I think the prevailing narrative in the West misses a big context. See, if you look at American war on terror, which has gone on for about 20 years since 9/11, of course, in many different places, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now increasingly in Syria, and in Libya, in Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, right? And in Iraq alone, 200,000 civilians were killed. The vast majority of them are women. Well, people are bothered by that, but nobody accuses America of genocide because of the context of how America got into all these conflicts, even though the invasion of Iraq was based on, I would say, misinformation, whether it was deliberate or it was incomplete information. We don't know anymore, but obviously the Senate has admitted it was a mistake at the time. But because of that context, people seem to be much more forgiving when it comes to the casualties, the so-called collateral damages. In Afghanistan, in Pakistan, there are tens of thousands of casualties as well. So I think by not telling us about the context of counterterrorism campaign, then you really mislead the public with incomplete picture. All of a sudden, the motive becomes, well, why do you do something with a group of people? So you talk about ethnic repression, you talk about religious persecution, which is not the case. I pointed out in my article that there are 25 million Muslims in China.
Yes, you did.
Yes, in Beijing alone, there's 250,000 Muslims. Beijing, the capital, has 70 mosques, right? So obviously, there's no such a thing as religious persecution. And all the major Muslim countries understand it. And in fact, sign letters in support of the measures that China has been taking to fight terrorism.
So
the problem with Beijing is that China doesn't have a free press. See,
indeed,
I have not been to Xinjiang since almost 10 years ago by now, because the situation was getting dangerous. But since 2017, the situation is very much under control. But without a free press, then you wouldn't get the reporters to go there to report things on the ground, to tell the truth. So China is not doing itself a favor by not having a free press. That's the point that I made in my article.
So, Chan, I want to ask you, first of all, I hope you agree with me that the US-China relationship, I say this over and over again in my Polaris-Live interviews, that this is perhaps the most consequential issue of our time, this relationship. And not just in geopolitical terms, but in business terms and so many others. But my question to you is, do you know of any Western media that has reproduced the South China Morning Post article?
No, I'm not aware of any Western media reproducing the article, but I'm aware of one article written by Jeffrey Sachs, formerly Harvard and now advisor to the United Nations, and his co-author, with the title, a headline, "Genocide is Unjustified," something to that effect. They published the article in Project Syndicate just about a week ago, and they cited my article with a link to my article, and the flow of their argument somewhat follows my analysis in my article.
I have read that article, and like many people, I come to the conclusion, even though I don't have a legal background, that on the evidence, the charge of genocide appears unwarranted for China. But what I want to ask you, and I'm pressing this issue before we switch to a related but different topic, is that it just seems so obvious that China should allow more press to travel to Xinjiang. I mean, why doesn't it do that? The impression created here in America, where I am, and I suppose in Europe, is that China simply does not want the outside world to see what's happening in Xinjiang. I mean, we see satellite pictures of these big prisons. We see satellite pictures and documentaries of large numbers of people who are working in cotton picking plants. Why doesn't China just say, okay, BBC, okay, CNN, come on in? I mean, what is China afraid of?
Well, as we know, China is not democracy, and China doesn't have a free press. There's a censorship over there, and I have no idea why they don't feel secure enough to open up more when it comes to information, but that's just a fact. In fact, after I published my article, one person who lives in the United States, but who came from Xinjiang, wrote to me. And he said that when he lived over there, he was aware of some incidents in which, for example, he gave me an example, a middle school student was going to school on his bike, and a terrorist rode in front of him and used a razor blade to cut his throat. And that particular incident was reported by the police as a criminal activity as opposed to be a terrorist activity, because they didn't want to amplify it. They didn't want to publicize it. So they rather downplay that particular incident, even though the people over there all knew it was terrorist related. So I think there is just this tendency of downplaying a very serious issue, and now it has come back to haunt them.
Well, I think that you've laid that out very clearly, and so this Polaris-Live will always be available if China ever wants to equalize, if you will, or bring clarity to it. And at the risk of, only because of time, Chan, this is such an important issue, but I want to move to a related issue, again, keeping in mind what I do believe is true, which is China-American relationship is so important, perhaps the most important one in the 21st century. We are looking at pandemics, we are looking at climate change, and there's the leadership that America and China can show. but I'm moving now to the financial side, right? And I'm doing this because of this issue of what the West is not being informed of. Excuse me. And here, what I want to do is ask you: we are now getting information that Jack Ma, one of China's most enterprising and leading businessmen, is being sidelined because he is not obeying and following all the diktats of the Chinese Communist Party. That he and others of his ilk, which are part of the contributors to China's greatness today, are being thought of as becoming too independent. So that's the information that we're getting. Now, China and America are the biggest business traders. The standard of living of America and China is correlated. I remember a Wall Street Journal editorial that said that China has done more to control inflation in America than the Treasury Secretary. So my question is, are we getting the right information? Is China starting to think that Jack Ma and others of his type are becoming too independent? And I relate this back to what you said, which is the West getting the right information? Can you talk about that, please?
I don't think so. I think the Western press very often caters to popular sentiment, and very often they upplay certain things and downplay certain other things. Let me just give you an example. Last week or the week before, I saw an article in the New York Times about how certain restrictions that China has imposed have made life more difficult for foreign banks in China. So I read the article, and the article itself didn't actually say that. It simply said there were some new regulations, which of course affected both domestic and foreign banks. So I wrote a note to the reporter. I said, why is your title, your headline, so misleading to say that the foreign banks the impression is that foreign banks are targeted by all these restrictive measures, when in fact is the broad regulation change? And he said, I have nothing to do with the headline. The editor put the headline together. And in fact, the editor heavily edited my report as well. You see, the editor would give a headline which is actually, from my point of view, very misleading, because those measures are not designed against foreign banks. They're just new regulation affecting all the banks. When it comes to Jack Ma himself, I think he has reasons. If I were him, I would keep a rather low profile at this particular point myself. It doesn't mean that he's in trouble. A couple of things happened with his businesses. One is Ant Financial, which was just about to go public. And as we know, the IPO was pulled at the last minute. The IPO would have valued his company at $320 billion US. The reason it was pulled was because the new regulation was coming. Consumer finance companies were not required to put up a certain percentage of capital against their assets or against their loans. The new regulation would require 30% capital against their assets, which would have major impact on the business valuation of the company. So I thought it was rather prudent for regulators to pull the IPO until the new regulation is announced, is in compliance. And I'm sure at a certain point, Ant Financial would go back to the market. The suspension would not be permanent. The second thing happened was, for the first time, the Chinese antitrust regulators all of a sudden wanted to show teeth. China has had antitrust law since 2008, but has never enforced it. So this is the first time that China is enforcing antitrust, because on the platform of Alibaba or Taobao, they have a rule that as a seller, as a shop, as merchant, you either choose my platform or you're out. You choose me or somebody else, but you can't do both, which is clearly against the law. Consequently, Alibaba was fined very recently, I think in the past 2 weeks, $2.8 billion, or 4% of their revenue. And the law says between 1% and 10%, so they fine them 4% of the revenue. So Alibaba is very much in the crosshairs of the regulators, both on financial institutions and on antitrust. And there's a reason for him to keep a low profile. I actually saw somebody posting the flights of his private jet, the flight data online, to show that he actually has been pretty busy, flying around in China from this place to another. He's just avoiding spotlights.
But Chan, I really wanted to, I hope it'll be okay with you if we continue our conversation for a little while longer than scheduled, just so we complete this train of thought. Because I'm going to ask you now about a related matter, which is the possible delisting of Chinese companies in the US because of this upcoming, or not upcoming, because of this regulation that unless these companies subject themselves to American auditing procedures, that they risk being delisted. What do you think about that?
I can't imagine any private company would have valid reasons not to supply audit papers to regulators when required or requested. We were a major shareholder until a few months ago of a New York Stock Exchange listed company called Tencent Music Entertainment. We invested in that company many years ago under a different name. Eventually, we merged it with Tencent Music and then we rebranded it to become Tencent Music Entertainment. And we invested about $100 million. And now the company, or at the time we sold the stocks, the company was $45 billion and it was listed on New York Stock Exchange. I can't imagine if SEC says, you give us your audit papers, we would refuse. So I actually don't understand this issue. Maybe some state-owned companies listed on New York Stock Exchange would have a reason, or the regulators in China, since there's no protocol between the two regulators, would prevent them from surrendering certain papers. But for private companies, number one, there's no reason not to provide the papers when requested, unless you have something to hide. And if you really don't want to supply the papers, then you should be delisted. So I see this new law as being a good law. I mean, for the protection of investors, I think transparency is critically important. And I don't think it will affect good quality companies at all.
So are you saying then that this is another case? If you were writing an editorial on this, it might be titled that Jack Ma and Chinese companies listed in America, what the West doesn't tell you, right? I mean, are you saying that there's a misinformation being supplied to American business, American readers, that Chinese companies are refusing to do this? The impression then is created that these companies, just don't want to open their books, or the impression is being created that this is all part of the tight control that the Chinese Communist Party lays on its businesses and its companies, or what? I mean, I don't, like you, I'm confused with this. So I'm just asking you for a brief explanation.
Well, not necessarily. Not all the information is wrong. I mean, you do have fraud cases. For example, Luckin Coffee, just like Wildcard, was a fraud case.
Right.
And it was delisted, rightfully so, because they committed fraud. So I think to tighten the regulation is critically important for the protection of the market and for the protection of investors. I think the issue is sometimes there's a lack of information. For example, when it comes to Ant Financial, a number of reporters, mainstream American newspapers, called me to ask me why it was pulled at last minute. I gave my reasons, as I explained just now,
Yes.
including, for example, all the major banks like JP Morgan are regulated as systemic risk banks. After 2008, 2009, all of a sudden, regulators realized that a major bank like JP Morgan or Citibank would contain systemic risk, like Lehman Brothers. If they fail, the entire system collapses. And therefore, they're designated as such, they're regulated as such, there's higher capital adequacy requirements, there's higher reserve ratio requirements, there's higher compliance requirement, and so forth. Before Ant was priced for its IPO, nobody actually knew how large it was. At $320 billion, it was actually larger than JP Morgan, a 150-year-old global bank. And I think the regulators all of a sudden realized, my goodness, this is a systemic risk financial institution. And it ought to be regulated as such with regard to capital, with regard to who would regulate this particular institution. It was not by the central bank until very recently. Now it is being transformed into a financial holding company. So I told the reporter about all this. None of them was willing to print it. They all wanted to say that it was pulled because Jack Ma made some remarks critical of regulators. I'm critical of regulators all the time. Right? So, but that's just a good story to tell. And so part of it is lack of information, lack of understanding. Part of it is what is a good story. And if you don't provide the full picture, which is admittedly boring, then of course the public would not get the full picture.
Well, listen, I need to, I could really, this is such an important topic for so many reasons that I could go on for a long, long time with you. And, but I want to, as we run out of time, Chan, ask you the same question I asked. What we're doing with these series of conversations, the Foreign Policy Association in New York has asked me to write a short report on a fresh strategic approach to China-US relations. And like you, I've spent most of my life in business. And so what I'm doing is talking to a lot of people in China, EU, US, to filter my thoughts through them. And that's why this is so important that I was able to have you come on the program before this report is due the end of June. What I want to ask you now is, if you find yourself alone with President Xi Jinping and you're talking in private, what is some advice you would give him to thaw this daggers drawn approach that seems to have connected both the superpowers? And then the same thing on the American side, if you find yourself alone with President Biden, what is some of the advice you would give them?
I probably would feel much more comfortable talking with Biden than with Xi. With regard to Xi, I think, again, it's just information. All I can do is to share information, what I know about America. And with Biden, it will be the same thing, what I know about China. I recently gave an interview to Harvard Business Review, which has just come out in the May-June print edition of Harvard Business Review. And the interviewer, the chief editor, asked me, what is it that Americans don't know about China? And I said that Americans don't know how capitalist China is. Americans think of China as having some kind of secret China model to develop its economy, when in fact, based on my experience, I was a hard labor 40 years ago in the Gobi Desert, as I explained in my book, Out of the Gobi. At that time, all economic activities were controlled by the state. And China developed, and China didn't produce anything but poverty at the time, as you know, under Mao. And China developed in the past 30, 40 years by embracing the market, by developing a private sector, which now accounts for 2/3 of China's GDP. So the Chinese economy is very much a market economy. It is the largest trading nation in the world. It is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world, surpassing the United States last year. So then the editor asked me, what is it that the Chinese don't know about America? I said, well, the Chinese simply don't know how socialist America is. See, America has a well-developed social security system. China is still building its social safety network. It's underfunded, it's undefined at this moment. You put money in there, you don't know how much money will get out of it. And China doesn't tax the rich. There's no personal capital gain tax, whereas America does tax capital gains. And maybe that will increase with the new proposal by the Biden administration. So China now has more billionaires than America does. And in fact, China mints them at a rate 3-to-1 compared with the United States. So that's how capitalistic China is. And to some extent, America is socialist, right? So either country has very little understanding of something that they don't like. America.
I'm interrupting, but now force yourself to think, and I know you're terrified at the thought of being alone with President Xi Jinping, talking to him privately. What would you tell him? Give me a couple of things, or even one thing to improve this relationship.
First, I'm not terrified of speaking with anyone. So don't worry about it.
Sorry, I apologize.
Yes, I would say to be more open, to speak more openly and directly. I think that's the best way to communicate.
That is
and you see, if you look at the difference between the Chinese leaders, American leaders, Chinese leaders tend to speak too little, whereas American leaders tend to speak too much. Of course, Biden has not spoken as much as Trump has.
Well, you've certainly learned a lot in the time that you were in America. I am going to have to end this conversation because we are running out of time, and I just wanted to go on because we don't often get a chance to speak with someone who not just understands America, but understands China and understands geopolitics and understands the importance of trading business relationships to the world. So I wanted to really, Chan, thank you for taking this valuable time. I know you must have every second of the day blocked out with your work. But I want to thank my viewers. But first of all, I want to thank you, Chan, for being on Polaris-Live.
Well, thank you so very much for having me.
And,
it's a great pleasure talking with you.
And don't go away. I shall be back to you shortly. But I just want to thank our viewers once again for being part of Polaris-Live. If you go to my website, kashmeri.com, you'll find a list of our guests going forward. And I hope to see you again next Tuesday. And until then, goodbye.